And make sure captions, if it's working for anyone who needs it. Okay, should be working. Anyone who can set it up. If there's any issues, let me know. So, hi everybody. Hope you're all doing well today. So just have two things that we're going to kind of go on the agenda today. We were originally going to have some of the case study presentations done, but we've just moved those over. So if you look at this Google Sheet, this is the new schedule for the case study presentations from across the group. And you can see that it's going to be on 11, 13, and 14. Now, I don't have any issues if there is some horse trading that wants to take place across groups or something like that. If you want to make some extra money on that, I'm totally, you do whatever you need to do on your end. If you're a week 14 and you're willing to negotiate with someone else who wants it, I just don't, you do whatever you need to do. But if there is any kind of major issues, just let me know and we can kind of try and figure out what we do. I might have to then kind of, if there's any issues, just let me know. Did I miss anything or any major issues that someone wants to raise right now?
In general, I was just wondering because like we've received a couple of marks back, but normally like we're given it through Brightspace, we can kind of see all of
I
our
would love if someone knows, like I would love to figure out, because I've done it for Brightspace, but I've only seen how you do it in Brightspace at the end,
okay.
not during the whole course of it. So what I can do is this afternoon, if someone knows how to do that on Brightspace, I would love to kind of get some help on that. But if not, what I will do is I will take my Excel spreadsheet that I have for everybody's course and send an email to each individual student with the Excel spreadsheet that I have record of. So you have it all at once.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, but like
Okay.
not a huge deal if that's too much work.
No, it's easy. It's easy to do. I'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
Let me
Yeah,
just mark this down.
unfortunately,
So
I don't know how to work Brightspace either. So
I've
I
tried to do it and I found out how to do it for the final marks, but not on an
uh,
ongoing basis. And there is the ability for students to see it if it's not a group project. But as soon as it's a group project and it's submitted by one person, the mark only goes and recognizes it for that one person who actually submitted it and not for the group as a whole. So that was just one of the issues.
yeah.
Shahana.
Yes, I'm just wondered, in the doc file you share, at the top it is written week of the class presentation will be week 9, 11, and 12.
Oh, well, no, that's from the previous one. I didn't change
Okay,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
So it is
So
11,
let me just
12,
fix that. It's 11,
13, and 14.
11, 13, and 14. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so I'll send marks to everyone via email.
Thank you.
Sorry, there was somebody else's hand up that I missed, and I can't remember whose hand it was.
It was mine. It's Karen.
Oh, yeah, hey, Karen.
It was the same thing that Shahana was asking about. I was confused because when you go through the assignment schedule, it had the due date for the first part of the case study, and then the second part 1 was due February 16th, and then there were no subsequent due dates in the other sections. So I got really confused, and one of my group members texted me and said, "Do we have to present today?" And I said, "I really hope not, because I got nothing." Okay. So I said, "It looks like it's
yeah, you don't.
Okay. So sorry, let me grab, what were the dates again? Was it 10, 11?
So week 11 is not this coming, sorry, give me 1 second.
2 weeks.
Yeah,
right?
it's 2 weeks. So let me just pull up the list here for the, I have it open.
I can't find my pen.
Where is
I had a
the
pen. Where is my pen?
schedule?
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said, week 11?
Week 11 is, sorry, give me 1 second here. I'm just going to pull it up to make sure I've got it, everything right on the dates here. So week 11 is March 24th.
Okay,
Oh, wait a second. I got it right. March 12th is week 12 is March 31st, and week 13 is the one that's off. So let me just make sure I confirmed that. March 31st, that actually might be, I might have gotten the kind of schedule. When is Good Friday here? Let me just kind of go on. Sorry. Give me
it
one
is
sec.
March 31st. Is
Okay,
Good
so it's the schedule that's wrong. Okay, so week 12 is the Good Friday. All right, we're going to switch that around. Not that it saves you guys, but we got it right. We got it right. Okay, in the schedule. So I'm gonna just put that up here. So I got that right. Okay, so week 13 is April 7th.
Okay,
And week 14 is April 14th. So it's the case study presentations. If you're week 11, you're March 24th. If you're week 13, you're April 7th. And if you're week 14, you're April 14th. Let me just also throw that into.
I think
Google.
April 14th is a Monday.
Sorry, give me 1
Our
sec.
last week of class is week 14.
No, it's week 15.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's April 21st. That's my understanding anyway.
No, we're finished April 19th.
April
Is
19th.
our last
Okay.
day.
Oh, all right. Okay, so we have no week 15. Maybe they could have changed the schedule. I thought that that it used to be 15 weeks, but it also used to be 3 hours per week. Now it's 2 hours per week. So maybe is it now 14 weeks the semester? Wait, so
And
if that's the case,
And April 7th is a Sunday. I'm confused. I'm very confused.
okay, did I get the wrong one? Sorry. Oh yes, you're right. I am so sorry. I opened up the wrong folder. Okay, sorry. I opened up the last year's course outline, not this year's course line. That explains it. Sorry. I was going into the wrong year for the outline. Sorry. All right, let's go back to the right year.
Yeah, and week 11, March 24th is also a Sunday.
Okay. So I got it here. Week 11, March 22nd. Week 13, April 5th. Week 14 is April 12th. And week 15 is April 19th. And I'm sorry, that was the wrong year I was looking at for the document.
Okay, so those
if
are
you
the.
are on week 11, you are March 22nd. If you are week
Where
13,
do we see when we have to? Where do we see where we have to present? Because I was looking for that too.
That is up in this Google Doc right here. Put it in the, just in case for those who came later.
Because I was looking for that on dim space. I'm calling it dim space.
It's just written in the it's written in the assignment number 2 instructions.
Oh, okay. Because I went through that and I didn't see it. Okay, I'll double check.
But that is the Google Sheet sign on. Thank you, whoever's doing that. Thank you.
I figured
Yeah.
it would keep us all on the same page.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna write.
Yeah, and I can give you the dates again. So week 11, March 22nd. Week 13 is April 5th. Let me make sure I'm using the right one. Yes. And week 14, April 12th. And week 15 is when the last assignment is due, and that's the theory of change and logic model one. And unfortunately, I've gotten into trouble in the past. Whoopsie, whoopsie. But I've learned. Took me 2 years to learn it. But I can't give extensions for the last assignment because I have to have everything in by, I think, the Monday of the weekend after. So that's the one assignment I don't have the luxury of being able to provide any extensions on. Oops. Any questions on the weeks? Any questions on the assignment number, case study presentation, or the role playing?
Just to see if I like, maybe this will see if everyone understands it, but
Yep.
So it's like we're doing the 5-page report, and then basically what is in the report we're going to be presenting. And then at the end of the presentation, each one of us, is it each of us takes 3 minutes to present a stakeholder
Exactly.
perspective?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for those who are like, again, each person in the group will choose one stakeholder to play the role playing game with. And the 5-page report, I should also mention the 5-year report, because the case study presentations have to be done over a series of weeks just to make time for everybody. The actual report, the written report that you submit, it doesn't need to be submitted until all the case studies are done. You can submit it at any time. You can just email it to me at any point in time. But as far as a deadline for it goes, it's like Friday midnight on week 14. But my only one suggestion is don't wait that long if you don't have to wait that long, just because week 15, another assignment is due. Oh, thank you. Any questions on that? Any questions on the case studies? Case study presentations or anything? All right, excellent. I'm really looking forward to it. It's always my favorite part of the class is getting these case studies. And you'll be, I think when all of you will be very pleasantly surprised at how much you could learn in a case study presentation of like a half-an-hour conversation with a group on this on a topic, and how much of the story you can actually get. All right, so case studies, we're dealing with that. So the other topic for this week is a presentation series that it's not about environmental justice. It's, again, another one of those. Now we're going to move a little bit more into a kind of a little bit of side tangent on psychology. And this is all about overcoming resistance to change and the tactics, strategies that are used in change management as a whole. So I'm going to take you a little bit through a story and really want to kind of recognize that this is something that's going to apply to any change management endeavor that you are a part of, and you will be parts of a lot of change management endeavors because it is change, as you can imagine, change management is not the easiest thing in the world. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. All right, so let me just get the view slideshow full screen. All right, and I'm going to share my screen. Dun, dun. I'm gonna, there we go. And I'm gonna do this one. All right, okay. What? My online course session has expired? Oh, I know what that meant. Okay, I was doing something that I was out of compliance with. All right, I gotcha. So I can't see the visuals. So if anybody has any questions or anything like, just please just chime in. Don't bother raising your hand or anything. Just chime in, just so I can keep. It's easier that way. We can advance the conversation. So this week is really, I'm not going to go through the previous week's summaries, but really what I'm going to talk about today, and this is kind of like all of these different tactics, strategies, is taken by this book called Strategic Organizational Change and Overcoming Resistance to Change. It's a workshop, and the author of that one is Michael Beetler. If you haven't yet and you are interested in digging a little bit more into this, I definitely would recommend that book. It's a really great book in terms of understanding change management. The partnership brokering resources that I've also highlighted in past weeks is also a really good place to go in terms of understanding that change management. There's a lot of resources for change management from the partnership brokering kind of resources as well. But I did want to highlight one of the kind of learnings that we all have to encounter and learn over the course of time is that a lot of the times when we are wanting to advance something that we think is important and we encounter resistance in the form of like people pointing out barriers or kind of raising out some kind of concerns and issues that they think that are going to kind of limit its ability to work. One of the tactics that we often rely on is to push harder. So really what we often do is we kind of encounter, like, want to get some change management, change happening, and someone or something or system, so we'll talk about this, but like, let's call it someone is putting up barriers and resistance for why this change can't happen because there's barriers associated with it. One of the tactics that we also kind of succumb to is that we start pushing for the change we want to see happen. And that's a natural inclination when we counter resistance, is to push against that resistance. But in many ways, what has been found to work more effectively is to identify what the barriers and issues that they're raising are, and then work towards addressing those barriers and issues. And that is often a more constructive way to be able to overcome those resistance forces on it. So rather than like doubling down on the force you're doing to push a person towards the change you want to see happen, hearing them, identifying the issues, and starting to work with them on how you could address how we could collectively address, because it's not your responsibility to address all barriers. Collectively, it's a goal to address and reduce barriers. That is a much better tactic when you're trying to advance change management than just continually double down and putting more force into the change you want to see happen. It's just something that's really important to kind of notice as you're engaging in these change management conversations, that rather than pushing harder, how can you kind of go across and understand what their barriers are, what's the issues that are kind of stopping them from making that change happen, and then working with them to address those barriers. And it helps a lot more in terms of getting change management happen. Another really important opportunity, and this is because it can feel extremely overwhelming when you're trying to make a change happen, is that you don't need everyone on board. You think you have to kind of like get everyone on board, and you don't. In fact, you never will be ever able to get everybody on board. And so when you're kind of looking at it from the kind of thinking this change management, recognize that you don't need to convince everyone. If you can convince the 5% of the group who's really important on kind of making this change happen, if you can get some really good examples and get some change happening with a small little population of the groups that you're trying to kind of make the change happen with, that is a really good starting point. And don't knock that. That's a great place to be. And then once you get those kind of, let's say we're going to call them the 5% of people, the early innovators. Once you get those, you can use them as case studies to tell the story to others who are kind of probably going to be the early adopters. And then from those early adopters, you're going to kind of get the early majority. And once you get the early majority, you're already kind of really close to the top of the hill. And you're going to probably kind of really be making that change management happen. Once it reaches that early majority time period or that kind of phase in its change management, it has its own momentum and it's moving forward. I'm not saying you can kind of slack off and not kind of see any kind of, because there could be some systemic barriers that then kind of make it so that you can't make it from early adopters to early majority. And those are things you're going to have to probably address if there is systemic issues that mean you're having a lot of resistance before getting from the innovators and early adopters into the early majority. But once you've got the early majority, that is enough to get that change to stick. But that main message is you don't need everyone. And also, don't waste your time on the late adopters and diehards. Just leave them alone. They'll come over when the system changes. You don't even have to worry about the late majority. They'll come over after as well. It's the innovators that you want to kind of get on board, use those as case studies to kind of show the change happening, move towards getting getting them to kind of be your sales force to the rest of the early adopters. And then that's where you can really make that kind of change stick. So, talking about the steps to change. So obviously the first one, identify the change you want to happen, why it's important to make that change happen, right? So what's the problem with the existing scenario? What's the problem with the current situation? And why is it that people should care about needing to make the changes to the current situation? Then how can you make that change? And that's the developing that kind of like intervention. What are you going to do about making that progress towards your hoped for change? In terms, again, like let's say, for example, the innovators, and you kind of like, you make some really good, you get some good case studies, good stories to tell from that kind of early intervention that you've advanced. Tell those stories to reward the kind of efforts that have been made, celebrate the efforts and change that has happened, remembering that you don't need to get everyone on board, you just need to get some on board, and then use some of those examples, those case studies, to help kind of build the marketing and branding and the outreach that you're going to need to do to get some additional people coming on board with that change that you so desire. So I think this is where we kind of like one of the reasons why I push the team approach on a lot of the assignments on this class is that if you are able to make the change happen without having to work as part of a team, more power to you. But in many of the complex change, and it doesn't have to mean like if you can make those changes without having to work in part of a larger stakeholder team, more power to you. Go for it, get it done. But very, very often, the complexity of many of the changes that we want to see happen mean that you have to work with a group of people to make it happen, a group of groups probably to make it happen. And so the great thing about, the teams and all that stuff is that it kind of brings a whole variety of diversity of viewpoints and opinions and directions that they want to take. And that's a real advantage, but it's also a major disadvantage. And it's, again, kind of like it's a double-edged sword on that one. A lot of diversity in views makes it so that you have a lot more input and you can see your options available to you. And you can really figure out what might work and what might not work. And what are the unintended issues that might occur from some of the interventions, because you have a variety of different perspectives reviewing the change you want to see happen. And again, the major challenge with that is differences of views makes it more complex and makes it a little bit more complicated in terms of making a consensus or agreed upon decision moving forward. But there's this book called The Wisdom of Crowds that's about the kind of the importance of this. And what they mean by crowds is not having people who always think the same way. And we always kind of have that. We tend to kind of like to have our teams where there's enough commonalities. And this is where I was saying, you can have very different perspectives, but you have to have a common agreed upon vision goal that you all agree you need to achieve. And that's why it could be sometimes painful when you're in the early stages of that partnership brokering team development to really dig into what are the it might seem like kind of like a luxury or navel gazing when you're kind of going through this exercise of what's the vision that you all kind of agree on and the hope for outcome that you can all agree on. But it really does help to have that in there, because then you get a diversity of perspectives, but everybody does kind of agree on advancing the common goal. And that really enables you to have a lot more flexibility because of flexibility and willingness to listen to different viewpoints and identify some unintended consequences that certain stakeholders will have a better sense of than you may have a sense of. And that's where that diversity in perspectives and input and experience really comes in handy and a value in a team. Again, as you can see, it adds further complexity. It can create a bit barriers. It's harder to kind of make a final decision on which one you go through forward. So it's always a balancing between the value diversity brings to a team, while also recognizing the complexity that a diversity brings to the team. All right. So this is where things get often quite contentious and challenging in team building. And the conflict is going to be inevitable. So having a fear of conflict within your group, and this is my weakness. This is always something that I have to work on as well. I do not like conflict. And so when I'm playing this role of facilitation or facilitator in a group environment, my tendency is to placate or to diminish the conflict occurring. And that's not always a good thing. In fact, I'm not saying, there are certain rules of how we engage in differences of opinion. There's certain rules on how, what the group dynamics will be. And that's another one that's really important to kind of get everybody to agree on at the beginning when you're doing your mission, and hopeful outcomes agreement on it. So there's disrespect and abuse is not allowed in any of that kind of realms. But there's a lot of value that can come from conflict and or differences of opinion, and they are nuggets of gold because they can really highlight to you some of the issues, pitfalls, sinkholes that your project or initiative could fall into if you weren't really willing to dig into those harder to discuss topics. So it's something I've had to learn over the years. It's kind of like something I probably will have to learn for the rest of my life, unfortunately, but that's okay. But allowing that space for those differences of opinion and not trying to continually eliminate conflict or differences of opinion in group dynamics is something that really can help you, because there's so much value that can come from exactly. That's, yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's just something that we kind of, it's a tendency that many of us have. So stakeholders. So as we were talking and digging into the stakeholders, so there was like really, we broke them into different groups, like those who are most affected, very powerful. So there's different ways that we were breaking down our stakeholders and their perspective. Here's some other kind of there's still the same ones that kind of are along those lines, but they're the immediate clients, the ones you absolutely have to get on board to make that change happen. The hostile parties are the resisting forces against you, those who are most likely to be your enemy in terms of wanting to make that change happen, often for their own self-serving purposes associated with that. But they also are often quite powerful. So you also have to take that into account for it. And then there's this group that I like to kind of call unsuspecting stakeholders, but it requires a little bit of creative thinking on other kind of, I sometimes like to call them strange bedfellows. The ones who are stakeholders that if you kind of thought your project or thought of your initial intervention and you thought about different kind of policy goals you might be able to achieve, who else could you bring on board that could mean that your intervention, your change that you want to see happen, you're doing it, let's say I'll use in my example, I'm doing it because I want to get rid of greenhouse gas emissions in new developments. But what if we also worked with rate-based people in terms of reducing people's operational costs over the long time, protecting them from stranded assets, all of those rate-based people who are you would think that they're not normally the stakeholders, because everybody kind of assumes that the low carbon will be more expensive, and therefore the rate base would be kind of apprehensive about it. But if you were able to kind of work with them and kind of addressing their concerns and hearing what they have to say, then there is opportunities for being able to engage them in your collective approach. And the more diverse stakeholders you have, the stronger your ability to affect those in decision-making power will be. So there's always the one keep in mind on that one. So what are the steps in terms of change? What's the kind of, the pathway across this fraught stream sometimes? Worrying about floodwaters to come down and worry about you too. I don't know where I'm beeping from. I don't know if you can probably hear me beeping. So let me just give me a second. I'm going to turn off the sound for my sharing so that you don't hear me beeping. Okay. And then I'm going to share it again. And I'm going to get rid of sound just so you don't have to hear the beeping too. All right. So first thing, people often will, not want to add more to-dos to their list. So you got to establish some sort of sense of urgency, why they should care about this problem, why they should dedicate time and effort to it. That's an important part of the kind of piece of the puzzle in terms of advancing this change. You want to build a team of people all around you. And often you're going to focus in on the people who are supportive of you. Those are the teams you're going to really need to support on this. So you're going to bring those people together. And I'm not saying you could ignore the people who are going to be resisting your, oh yeah, go ahead.
You shared the wrong screen.
Oh, sorry, wrong screen. I will fix that. There it is. Thank you. All right. So you're going to have to kind of build that kind of team of people around you. I'm not saying that you don't necessarily need to bring in your quote unquote enemies into this right at the beginning, or your resistant forces, as shall we call them, right at the beginning. You could probably build up your kind of team of supportive team first, and trying to do a lot more research and understanding what are the barriers you're going to be facing from your those resistant forces who are not going to want to make this change. Whereas talking about the vision and the strategy, like what is the kind of the hope for outcome that you can all agree on? And again, I'm not saying you have to bring in the resistant forces at this stage of the game. I'm saying you will have to kind of engage with them at some point in time to hear what they have to say about what the change you want to see happen. But you don't necessarily have to do that right from the beginning. You can build your kind of supportive team first, build their kind of common vision. And that often is a much better tactic to use before trying to bring in the larger group of people who are going to be the resistance forces to you. I do think that it really helps that when you're building up your kind of supportive team, you're going to want to develop that vision, strategy, common agreements, how this is going to function, what the rules of engagement are going to be for yourself. That will put you in a stronger position to negotiate that vision and mission when you are getting into that more complex team building effort where you are engaging with the resistant forces of your endeavor. Communicating and creating a kind of common messaging associated with that vision and plan and the need for action and why that's the direction that you want to go in is also really, really important to bring it in so that everybody is singing from the same song sheet. That's going to be really helpful in your communications with other entities that may not be quite as supportive. Let's say government, because change is difficult for them and they always kind of like, oh, is this something I really need to deal with? And then the resistance forces on those who are benefiting from the status quo and want to maintain the status quo the way it is to serve their own purposes. Where I was saying in terms of the communicating that kind of vision and change for action, that's really important in terms of that common song sheet. The empowering the action, and this is where I was saying, again, you don't need to get everyone to change. If you can find 1, 2, 3 change examples, then that's a good place to start, because those 1, 2, or 3 people will serve as case studies that you can now promote to a larger group of people. And there's some experience that they can share. And it's not just this kind of esoteric kind of change. You're actually got some real world implementation happening, and that story can be shared with others. You want to kind of identify what your short-term wins are. How is this benefiting? Again, that's about kind of bringing that vision and mission and re-updating the communications and messaging associated with it, and kind of really celebrating the short wins. And this is something that I find, again, is also a bit of a challenge in the social services sector, environment sector, all sectors that are resource strapped have a lot of issues and a lot of fights to pick and a lot of not a lot of resources to do it. We don't often spend the time getting our kind of celebrating the wins. We're kind of always moving on to the next thing that needs to happen because there's such a overwhelming pressure of all the things that need to happen and the change that needs to happen. But I would really, really, really encourage a kind of more celebratory, reflective kind of time period when some change is achieved and there's something to celebrate on that one. And that's what I mean by generating those short-term wins and celebrating those short-term wins and communicating those short-term wins. That celebration, that winning, that kind of storytelling consolidates the change and helps to produce more change. It really does work. Same thing when I kind of advance a lot of work with the municipalities. I don't need to get all municipalities on board. I ideally need to get 1 to 3 municipalities on board. Then we start working with those, and then we make some of the change happen, and then we get those municipalities to share their stories with all the other municipalities. That 3 hopefully becomes a 6. Once you get to the 6 to 8, then you're kind of really kind of starting to solidify that change. And now it's becoming an expectation on the part of other municipalities that this is something that they should be doing because there's enough critical mass of other municipalities who are moving, and that 3 becomes 6, becomes 10, becomes 20. And that's really what helps to make that anchor, that new change in the culture. That really does help that kind of building that kind of experience over time. All right, so this is when I did this presentation when I went through a bit of a stage on my demotivational images I was pulling together. So again, the establishing of a sense of urgency is really helping to address the inevitable inertia that we're all face when we have to make a change. Change is hard, change is kind of more work. And so that's where the sense of urgency. Why is it a problem? Why is the present status quo a problem? Why do I need to put the time and effort into changing it? And what benefit will it have to me? What benefit will it have to others? What benefit will it have to something I care about? So that sense of urgency helps to address inertia as a very inertia is a formidable force to overcome. And that sense of urgency helps with that. You don't necessarily always have the same sort of opportunities to address this. There's always complacency that you got to address, and that complacency is your enemy. Really, when it comes down to it, those who don't want to change, that is going to be a challenge that you're going to have to deal with, and you're going to need a team of people. You don't always, again, need to kind of force it upon everyone. If you got your kind of core group who you can make that change with, ignore the ones who are complacent. They will come on board. They're going to probably the laggards afterwards. But you don't necessarily want to kind of always spend your time bringing complacent partners on board. You don't always need them. You don't need them all at once. So what are the sources of complacency? Really, the people may not see it as a problem. It's not a problem for them, so therefore they don't think it's a problem. Often enough, too much resources can also be a very good reason for why people may be complacent or organizations might be complacent. I could give you an example. Like right now, we don't get a lot of change in the energy field. Why? Because they're complacent, because the status quo works for them and they have a guaranteed rate of return. So you don't get innovation in a regulatory an electricity market because they're always just told what to do and there's no rewards for innovation. Same thing. So this is where they just have the system is just too much set up for their purposes. So they get complacent. Low performance standards, where we're not really expecting a lot from people, or we're not reporting or expecting them to report on monitoring and progress that they're making. That low performance standards, again, puts a sense of complacency because it doesn't really put the fire under their butts that the change is needed. Silos, and that's what I mean by organizational structures with narrow functional roles. It's just the silo. This is not my job. This is only what I do. I don't care how what I do affects other silos or how their functionality. That is, again, breaking down silos. It's another one of my, like, every time I work on a project, I always ask myself, like, okay, how is this helping to break down silos? Because the silos are killing us. Kind of measuring the wrong things also happens, you know, like you kind of think about, you could say that your performance indicators, if your performance indicator is, if it is just, I'll use an example. Many of the times, the performance indicator for a lot of the projects I work on is how many tons of GHG emissions will it reduce? And you're like, okay, well, if you're trying to change system-wide issues, then your project may not actually reduce 1 iota of GHG emissions in itself. But if this change happens, it can affect a significant amount of GHG emissions because you now have changed the system that is kind of, and I'll use an example of this. My kind of change, like the change I might want to try to do, is advance green development standards within municipalities that force developers to think about how they can meet energy needs in a lower carbon mechanism way. But the status quo is so easy for them to kind of opt into that they often don't do any of that kind of considerations. Why? Because the status quo works for them and it's good. They don't need to change it for as far as they're concerned. So we're coming in saying that they really need to start worrying about GHG emissions. They saying, well, you know, there is no real kind of penalization on GHG emissions for them on this one. So municipalities have been advancing green standards to kind of push the hand of developers to consider lower carbon options and meet different types of energy efficiency and GHG metrics in the new developments. Green development standards themselves, if we only used GHG emissions as a performance indicator for green development standards, we probably would be missing some of the things because the standards and policies themselves don't really reduce emissions. But what the policy achieves in terms of change in the market does have reduced emissions associated with it. So you'd probably need to kind of consider how many more green development standards, how many developments are taking place, and then how much are those developments reducing their GHG emissions against business as usual. And so you can see that your performance metrics are not just GHG emissions, but they're also green development standards. How many developments are going for the improved tier? How many developers are going for the higher tiers? All of those different things are part of the performance indicators you would use. You would probably also want to use things like, okay, how many more developers are now doing low carbon energy planning studies that they were doing before? Because that's also a change that you want to kind of advance on this one. So I just wanted to kind of say the flexibility and making sure that your activities are using performance indicators that you can really track that enable you to kind of see the change that is taking place. Lack of feedback, again, that's kind of like that comes down to everything's fine. Again, where the people do not want to have conflict occurring, I would say that's also along those lines. It kind of goes into the kind of denial of problems and too much happy talk from senior management, the ones who try and placate any kind of sense of just kind of discomfort or issues being raised. Like everything's fine and hunky-dory, don't worry about it. No fighting allowed. That kind of stuff on that one, where it kind of does kind of have that, create that sense of complacency because they don't feel change is possible. And again, the kill the messenger culture is just really, again, anyone who kind of, again, brings different changes, again, are the ones who kind of get sidelined rather than rewarded. The ones who are pointing out problems and issues and ways to address them, instead of being rewarded, they're penalized for bringing that to the team. Okay, so what do you do about complacency? Helping to storytell what the change can be, what storytelling relating to what the problem is, and story relating to what the change could be. And it's one of the kind of things that we often fall down quite a bit on the kind of, we don't tell stories. We use a lot of data and numbers in a lot of our work, and that doesn't really tend to motivate people. So we want to kind of do a little bit better in terms of visuals and helping to kind of see what the change could be and why it's important. And not just on groups, because we all know about that kind of how the human brain and human emotions are kind of like telling the story of an individual is often far more powerful of this larger group that is kind of more nebulous. Cost of the status quo. We have a tendency, it's one of our cognitive biases, but we have a tendency to think that status quo is the cheapest. It is almost as if it's free. And no, and always the status quo always has implications associated with it, and it always has cost associated with it. But we don't tend to think of status quo in that way. We tend to put a whole bunch of things that are not the status quo, and they have to compete against this, but we really don't actually put the status quo through the scrutinization that we really should be putting the status quo in the exact same way we're doing it with other kind of the change we want to see happen. Pulling that out and in challenging and kind of costing out or speaking to what the issue is with the status quo and the implications of the status quo is really important to bring in as well. You want to create stretch goals. You don't want to push people so far that they feel that they can't meet that level. So that's really where you want to kind of create stretch goals. You might want to kind of bring in change in stages so that you don't overwhelm all at once. That kind of will be possible in some scenarios. It won't be possible in all scenarios, but it's something that you want to kind of see. If you have the ability to kind of bring this in stages, it can help to address a lot of the resistance that you're likely or could encounter. The cross-functional teams and cross-functional goals really just helps to make sure silos get broken down a little bit in your intervention and your activity that you're doing, and it really just helps to ensure that the same mistakes aren't made over and over and over and over again, because the silos, people making decisions only within their own narrow little job description and their own little silo, does increase the likelihood that unintended consequences are going to rear their ugly heads. And that's also numerous heads. It's kind of like one of those mythological, like I guess that is like this, which one is that mythological creature that you, Hydra, you cut out, yeah. Reevaluating how success is measured. What that means on that one is really what you want to do is not be so narrow. And again, your kind of definition of success. Is it going to be just, let's say, for example, on the green development standards, are you going to throw all your information just on the GHG emissions that are happening? That's not necessarily going to motivate everyone in the same way. But if you start talking about the green development standards and now you're bringing in a whole new market on HVAC, cold climate air source, heat pumps, energy efficiency work that is taking place, new job creation that is taking place, you can see how you can build a lot more under other stakeholders to your effort in a way that will help you build a stronger change force on that side. And what I mean by actively seek feedback from external sources, it means that you don't have to do everything on your own. By building this team, team members can play different roles and different roles in this change management and then support each other. And let's face it, you can take down a far bigger I'm not going to use the word, but you can take down a far bigger kind of goal if you're hunting in a pack than if you were just hunting in with one stakeholder or one group. That kind of collective effort is something that's really powerful. I'll use an example. We often joke around it within the environmental field of hunting like a pack, that we're one environmental group that's more often a community group that's housed within the municipality that we want to see the change happen, goes in and kind of discusses these things with council members, raises the problems, drives their awareness of this as a problem, gets them to bring it to council, gets them to direct it to staff to get it done. And then there's other organizations that work with the municipality and staff to help make that change happen and build up their capacity on the change. But it's very hard to have those two roles be the same entity. If they're one wagging the finger at the municipality trying to say you're falling behind, you need to do more, that often needs to be a different entity, the one that says, oh yeah, we can help you do that. We can help you kind of build that kind of capacity for this change to happen. I call that the hunting and pack strategy. Again, the not killing the messenger and then making it a hospitable environment for people to raise issues or potential issues means that you don't necessarily kill the messenger on many of these things, that you actually reward or respect the individual or the organization who kind of raises their hand and says, I see a potential problem here. I don't mean it to the sense of like those kind of entities who are using those barriers as a mechanism to undermine the change, but those who are kind of pointing out some things and then working across the team for addressing how likely is this to happen, who would be affected if this happens, and what could we do to address this barrier that issue if it does happen, or what can we do to mitigate against that happening. Pointing out you don't have to have everything perfectly well designed. You just need to kind of understand what your weaknesses and barriers are, see which ones you can deal with, see which ones are kind of things that you probably may not be able to deal with, but they also may not be likely to happen. And then this is your risk mitigation strategy associated with it. And then just really kind of trying to be as realistic and kind of addressing problem solving as possible, in the sense of rather than kind of just like either giving up because barriers are being raised, or two, pushing against on the barriers. You don't know what you're talking about. That's not a real barrier. It might very well be a real barrier. It might also be a red herring that they're trying to kind of throw you off on. And this is why life is hard, is because, you know, there's always that saying, you know, like that kind of like, you can't solve the problem by doing something the same way you've done it in the past, but then that's like what practice is. So which one is it? But again, that's why life is hard. All right. So change team. You really want to kind of identify who are the ones who are the buy-in from the key players. Like those are the ones you absolutely need to have on board or the effort will fail. There's those position power places, that kind of politicians, senior management, those types of kind of groups of those who are going to be the ones who you need to get on board, but they also are going to be trying to kind of deal with all stakeholders as relatively equally as they can appear to be doing that. I did want to kind of speak to the kind of identifying barriers, both perceived and real. And I think that sometimes if they're perceived barriers, they are real until people realize that they are perceived. And that's where the case studies, I think, are so important, because you then get the experience that where the people feel that there's absolutely guaranteed to have these barriers or issues kind of raise themselves. You can kind of point out from your case studies that they didn't always that's not, it might actually be a perceived barrier. I'll use an example. We do often a lot of work on advancing energy efficiency and then providing financing to residents to do their energy efficiency retrofits and be able to kind of have the cash flow that they need to advance these measures. And then they're provided with financing to do it, to address these measures, and then they can pay that back over a long-term period, whether it could be 10, 15, 20 years. Sometimes it even goes up to 30 years for like renewable systems. Lower interest is attached to the property. All of those were kind of like something that's being used as a mechanism to advance the energy efficiency while addressing upfront capital cost barriers that many are addressing. And then there's always the risk, like, what if they default on it? And of course, defaulting is a real risk. It happens all the time on that one. So, but in this specific case where a municipality, I'll use this example, a municipality or the federal government is loaning money to these individuals to get this work done, what's the actual real risk of default? Like, how much real world defaults are we getting as a result of taking on this additional loan to pay for these energy efficiency measures? So that was based on the market, looking at the market in California, well over a 2 or 3 billion. There's been some predatory lending there, so we'll kind of raise that. That's an issue that has occurred. But there's also been a lot of kind of local improvement charges that have been used to advance this things. Default rates are way lower than the norm. So very few people will want, and you also want to take this into consideration. You want to make sure you're not allowing predatory lending to take place in the sense that you're loaning someone $40,000 that doesn't have a rate of return, in terms that they're never going to save themselves $40,000 associated with the energy savings, and that they only can save 10,000. Really what you should be lending them on that point, Tiered, especially if they're in the kind of income vulnerable thing, is that they should not be loaning more than the savings that the energy efficiency measures will give them. But that kind of consideration, it was considered to be a real world, very valid risk in terms of increasing risks of defaults. After years of experience in the market, examples of it, it's been found that it's actually really more of a perceived risk. Very few people will lose the biggest asset that they have for an local improvement charge loan. If they are experiencing default, it's a much bigger issue than just their local improvement charge. And yeah, the credibility on this stuff in terms of your teams, if you got a diverse team of change makers, you're always going to get more credibility because of that diversity that you have in your team. And then in the leadership run, we're going to start talking about the leadership. But we also want to make sure that it's not just housed in one place. Want to spread that leadership across your team as best you can, because there's some issues if you have a leadership that's too centrally focused on one organization or one individual. So you want to cultivate that leadership across the stakeholder group. All right. You don't always have the luxury of picking who's on your team and who's not on your team. Hopefully you do. And then again, that's where the rules of engagement in the team are particularly important. If there's a specific individual or specific stakeholder who's not adhering to the code of conduct of how this group is going to work, that's something you got to have nip in the bud, because that can poison the whole effort. It really can poison the whole effort. So some of the kind of people to work, if you have the luxury of being able to kind of manage who's on the change team, some of the people you want to keep off, really big egos. They're only in it for themselves. They really don't make room for anyone else on that one. Be very cautious of that one. Figure out how the rules of conduct associated with the functionality of the team can help to address that issue if you are unfortunately saddled with that type of person or kind of bullied organization on the team on that stuff. The snakes are the ones who seem supportive, but they're kind of working on the back. I think it's a bit of bad kind of poor snakes have gotten another bum rap on this one. But those folks who are kind of like, they seem like they're part of the team, but they're actually kind of undermining the effort in other kind of hidden ways. And those you want to kind of see and keep track of how, if you have those people in your team, they can really derail your constructive opportunities. Did want to kind of highlight, again, this is where the leadership, it leaves you a little bit vulnerable. If your change team is really relying on one person to push this forward, and they might very well be effective, and I'm not saying don't go with that, and I'm not saying don't use that to your benefit, but don't put all your eggs in that basket, because that change happens on that one. You could lose that person on the team. You can lose that organization in the group. You do not want to have all your eggs in one basket for the one who is leading momentum. And you want to spread that and ensure that it's a wider diversity of individuals or organizations that are advancing the change you want to see happen. And leadership isn't really, I think this is where leadership isn't about just kind of telling people how to do it. It's about kind of also being able to listen to the groups as a whole and bring their input into the approach being used. Recognizing just because you didn't come up with the idea of the barrier doesn't mean that it's not valid. And really trying to kind of gather and create an open environment for that collective problem identification and problem solving. So did want to kind of highlight, you don't want to kind of go like, oh, we're going to work on changing the whole electricity system in a country. That would be a hell of an endeavor to take on. So you don't want to suit like that big picture thing. You want to kind of bring it a little bit smaller so that you can identify some short-term wins that you can then use to serve as a foundation for the bigger change you want to see happen over the longer term. So I really wanted to kind of highlight, just be careful about kind of what your end, I'm not saying absolutely have a vision associated with it, but don't put all your bets on that big vision. Bring your bets down into specific, more tangible activities and outcomes that you can achieve on your pathway to that big goal that you have. And also, the more resistance you're facing from cynics and resistors, the more likely and more valuable those short-term wins will really help you be. You might have to do this in changes, like one, getting a smaller change happen, then moving on to a kind of a little larger one and a larger one, and have a pathway or a roadmap approach as opposed to just jumping into your end goal. All right. Just while we're here, do people want to kind of, sorry, trolls, trolls, but again, I think it's giving trolls a bad name. And snakes, the snake characters are often far more kind of sinister and hidden in their tactics. The trolls are pretty like kind of like maybe the trolls are more like the big egos because they're pretty brutally obvious. They're not, yeah. Would people prefer if we kind of ended like 15 minutes early and then we don't have a break? Is that okay with everybody? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So again, really wanted to kind of, again, this is where I was consolidating games also means celebrating some successes, some early successes. It's something I still have to say in the kind of NGO kind of sector, social services, we are atrocious at this, and really we should do a lot more to improve the celebration of successes. Yes, we all know we're nowhere close to where we need to be, and it hardly feels like we have the luxury or the privilege of taking time to celebrate some successes. But I think that's where we really need to change that mindset, celebrate our successes, reduce the burnout that happens without individuals and as a collective, and helping to figure out how you can use these short-term wins to kind of help project you into the next pathway that you're going to be trying to, or the next pathway on the outcome that you're going to be trying to move towards. This is another area in the whole kind of change management roadmap that's kind of challenging. Sometimes on those short-term wins, you get them. And sometimes this is, again, a kind of unintended consequence of short-term wins, is sometimes that can kill the momentum too. So it's not like you kind of like the one thing you want to celebrate it because you want to have that success and you want to show it and highlight it and celebrate it and promote it to other people. But you also want to kind of recognize the risk of momentum loss on this. If people think, oh, we did that, that's problem solved. Well, one kind of endeavor, but you got to kind of want to take them along this big picture of how this celebration of this success is kind of put them in a better position towards the larger term goal that you guys all agreed that was something that was important. And that's where breaking that kind of creating that long-term vision is really important, because it's something that you can kind of like have your first kind of the long-term vision, but then also have the first win that you're trying to achieve, get those taking place, celebrate those, promote those, show some success, share your successes on that front, but have the next path that you're trying to jump onto or the next outcome you're trying to achieve ready, so that you can use that change that did happen to propel you into the next change, rather than kind of allowing people to kind of use this as an excuse saying, okay, well, that's solved. Yay, we're good. Let's move on. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that kind of wanting to balance the two out. All right. So identifying obstacles. There's always going to be lots and lots of obstacles in this kind of change management on your toy. And then the same thing sort of happening on the same, like when you're celebrating the successes that you've had, looking at for the kind of additional barriers that your next tranche of activity is going to potentially rise, and working through that. Really, you want to kind of like use data collections. You want to use input from stakeholders, use input from as many people as can, so you can identify what kind of what kind of barriers and obstacles you're going to be facing and what your ability is to address them. You're going to encounter barriers that you probably may not be able to address. You got to kind of understand, are those deal breaker barriers, or are they just issues that will come along as progress is made on the change you want to see happen? But collect data, collect information, collect input, do focus groups, reach out to people, trying to kind of get a sense from different viewpoints on what it is that are going to stop, what are the issues that may cause them to stop the change that you want to see happen, or what insights they may have on how it might hurt other change efforts that you have with groups. It's kind of repeating on the same sort of stuff I did on that one, but it goes to show you again, you want to kind of dress it in that kind of moving towards, and I'm not saying incremental. I'm not saying like, it sometimes feels like that. You haven't really made any change. Sometimes in this longer term process, your first endeavor will be incremental, and that's okay. That's okay. It's still progress, and it will help you kind of make those larger leaps moving forward. So don't kind of think about it just because you haven't changed the system on your first change effort that it's not worth the change, that change effort is not worthwhile. That often needs to start at an incremental stage and move forward. Now, it's really, really challenging to just work on that incremental change when the big change is causing so many negative impacts and you're feeling that it's so much pressure to get to the end destination as quickly as possible. And that is something that's hard to deal with. It really is. It really is hard to deal with. You know where you need to be, and you know you're nowhere close to where you need to be. How do you deal with that? Like, that's something that's kind of like, again, it's almost like you got to hold two opposing ideas in mind. You can see exactly where the status quo is, and that you can see that the change you're going to be trying to make is so hard and so big, and you're not seeing that you're going to be able to make that kind of leap. And there's so much more powerful entities trying to stop the change from happening. And then you still got to recognize all that, but you still got to defy all that and have the hope and the impetus to want to make the change, even if you feel like it's not going to happen. That's the holding these two dueling thoughts at the exact same time, totally contradictory to each other. But it's almost like that's like, you got to have that. You got to be able to hold those two, saying this is a huge fight. We may not win it, but damn it, we're going to do it. And we're going to put everything we have into it. Hope in the dark. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to read that. Now I'm just going to go.
She's the same woman who came up with mansplaining.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to totally, let me write this down. Sorry. I'm going to write this down. Hope in the dark. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go into some different types of conflict now, because as I was mentioning, I have an issue with conflict. It's probably going to be my lifelong endeavor to make more peace with it. So there's two different types of conflicts I wanted to kind of raise. There's the one where everybody's kind of talking over each other, those kind of meetings, you must have been to them, where everybody's talking and not really listening, and everybody's just kind of, that's definitely very obvious conflict occurring. So that's one of them. And that's one because you can't avoid it. You can see it right there in front of your face. But there's also kind of conflicts where people don't say anything. And those are harder to kind of dig into on that one. So it's an important one to kind of understand which form of conflict you're dealing with. And like, obviously, the blah, 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 where everybody's talking over each other and not listening to each other is one form of conflict that's brutally obvious, and you can't miss that one. And that's a probably different tactic that you would use to try and overcome that kind of conflictual situation. But then there's also kind of groups who are just like, you can go into a meeting, you can do your presentation, and you will hear nothing from everybody. And you're like, oh, okay, they agree with me. They may not. And that we're going to dig into a little bit on that one. There is that kind of, this is also, we'll talk about more. We're going to come back to the issue in terms of the negotiating kind of stuff. I want to come back to it afterwards. So I'm not going to go dig into it now, but I want to talk about some of the phases of change: denial, resistance, exploration, and commitment. Just remember we were talking about the marketing curve that's been used, like the innovators, the early adopters, the early majorities, late majorities, and then those always the laggards who come on afterwards. We're talking about this in terms of phases of change that we're going to dig into. And it's just a little bit kind of a guidance to help you know which part you are in or which part your team is in. So we're going to start with denial. There's not a problem. Everybody's fine, you know, that kind of stuff. And then denial and commitment, and they're you can kind of say like they're usually more kind of quiet on this one. It's not always, you can't really necessarily always see that phase of change, but you cannot always see that kind of the challenges or the kind of conflicts that you're trying to address. And as well, there's going to be a little bit different forms that you got to kind of look for. The resistance and exploration is a lot more active. There's a lot more kind of language taking place, a lot more communication taking place. Obviously, the exploration is where you want to go because now everybody's digging into different ideas for how they could solve the problem that everybody's bought into that we need to solve. The resistance one can be a very difficult stage to be in. And we'll go into a little bit on that kind of stuff because it sometimes feels like you're falling behind. You might be in the denial stage and you're not dealing with, people aren't kind of causing you conflict or causing you barriers and issues, and people are quite quiet, but they never bought into the change that you want to see happen. And so it's quieter and you can feel a little bit more frustrated because you're like, why isn't the change happening? Why aren't we making progress? People seemed in agreement with it. Well, that's where you might have kind of missed and assumed that this form of the quiet form where nobody's talking to each other and living in their own little worlds is acceptance, when really it was probably in the denial stage. And when you end up kind of moving from that stage, you know, into resistance, you could feel that your change effort is falling further behind. When in reality, it isn't. You've progressed. It just doesn't feel like progression because it's an uglier stage to be in, because it's more conflictual, but it is progress because now people are talking about the issues and barriers rather than just ignoring it and hoping it goes away. And I will call the denial stage the ignoring it and hoping it just goes away. And then the resistance stage is like, okay, this isn't going away, but I don't have the time or the effort or the money to deal with it. So I'm not dealing with it. And now you got to try, and this is where you're trying to identify what are the resistance forces that are making them not want to make the change, and what can we all do collectively to address those resistances that may be that they may be encountering. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about those ones. I should say on that things. The left of the lines is characterized by a fear of loss or extra work and other negative emotions generally, right? The right of the line can be kind of characterized by more kind of hopefulness and positive emotions, because now you're into kind of like not whether we should make the change, but how should we make the change? All right. So denial. This is I've made this mistake so many times. That's probably why I'm pushing it. But I have made the mistake to think that just that quiet denial, the not talking, means that they actually are committed to the change happening. And I have been sorely disappointed many a time when I realized that I interpreted the situation very wrong. So there's a lot of people who will just be like, you're kind of convincing them, you're trying to pitch them on this change needing to happen. And they'll all sit there kind of quietly looking at you, and they won't say anything against it, but they will just kind of hope that it just goes away because their job description is already full and they don't have any more time to deal with this. So, you know, maybe you'll just go away after a period of time when you realize it's not kind of like people aren't jumping on your bandwagon. So again, creating that sense of urgency is really important to address that denial stage. Bring in individuals to kind of people who have been negatively impacted by the lack of change occurring is really important, so they can make real world personal relationships with the people who are being impacted by the change, like being impacted by not having that change happen. And that will help to kind of overcome their kind of resistance or the lack of time or kind of effort that they feel that they have to commit to this. Also understanding that kind of denial is always connected up with a specific fear people have. So what is that fear? What are they afraid of? And digging into that is really important as well too. The resistance one. So as I mentioned, this often feels like the most difficult stage because if people are being loud, they're being what you might call like disruptive and negative in terms of bringing in all the barriers that they think are going to be an issue. And they're kind of all coming out to the surface. They were there before. They were just not being talked about. And this obviously is a very difficult stage, especially if you're someone who also doesn't like conflict. But it is progress over denial. And it starts to kind of bring in, and then you start kind of bringing in people's, like if people feel that they're raising what they see as legitimate issues and they see they're being ignored, that's going to really impact their willingness to participate in this into the future. Now, keep in mind, as I was saying, you got to kind of think about it from the perspective of your kind of positive stakeholders and your negative stakeholders. Your positive stakeholders, it is part of your job to figure out what is scaring them about the change and what can you do collectively to try and address it. Your kind of enemy stakeholders, you still need to understand their viewpoint. I'm not saying you don't need to kind of consider what you could be, what you may be able to do to address those issues and concerns and barriers that they raise. But really what you want to do is understand it and kind of have the language and the justification for whether what could be done about those barriers or why those barriers are less important than the impacts associated with the present status quo. And it's not like you're going to convince your enemy stakeholders. Very rarely will you. But what you need to do is have your positive stakeholders galvanize across the message of the need for change. And then there's the kind of, I'll call them the spectator. And usually they often involve like, you know, let's say government, maybe even media sometimes, because you want to build media profile. Yeah, take it away, Leah.
No, I was just gonna say that like when I was in grad school at Guelph, we had a guest speaker come in. Her name was Carla Fair. And she would write on epistemic injustice and like the need for more epistemic diversity or like diversity of knowledge, diversity of person in like the sciences in particular. And it was interesting listening to her because she talked about how at the end of giving some lecture where she was like, again, spouting the need for epistemic diversity, you know, like the justice behind it and everything, she had someone come up to her and say like, yeah, but like, why should I care about this?
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than taking it as like a slight, which it kind of was, she took it as an opportunity to then like create the argument, like, no, like, why should you care about this? Like, how do I orient this? So it's like, you know, she ended up writing an entire paper about how epistemic diversity leads to like new and novel ideas and how it like ends up creating more knowledge. And so I guess like that was a lesson not only in why epistemic diversity is important, but just also about how to like I don't know, like take that feedback as like no, like thank you. Let's figure that out then. Like how can I orient this conversation so that your resistance makes more sense and then like can be oriented in a way that like
and she turns that kind of barrier, that kind of like, you know, barrier or kind of indifference into a nugget of gold.
Yeah, an opportunity.
Then, use to try and see, probably there's a lot of people who felt the same way as that person who verbalized something that probably a lot of people were thinking but didn't want to verbalize. And now she has a different way to engage those types of people because she put that time, and rather than just saying, I'm not going to listen to what you have to say, she's like, okay, how can I use this nugget and use it to help build the justification for the change I want to see happen.
Well, and what I like, additionally, as the person who then got to learn from that, I think it also helps me realize that often as someone who wants to be a change maker, you don't have the language to be able to talk about these things, and you'll come up against these arguments and you're like, wait, heck, how do I actually present this in a way that translates to this person? So the more that you're able to kind of create those different laneways into a problem, or to a solution, I should say.
Yeah. No,
The
that's
more
a
you can
great
allow
point.
your base to figure that out too.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you've brought up, you probably have a story that you can share that can bring a whole bunch of other people who probably would not have paid any attention to
Yeah.
the change. And I think Frankie, someone said Frankie's trying to get in and it needs my approval, but I'm looking at here and I do not see Frankie anywhere trying to get in. So give me 1 second. Just because I'm going to stop this for sharing, I'm going to get the URL for it because I do have that right here. Course meetings, and then, oh, okay. Not beeping at me, computer. Friday, March 15th. No, we're not March. Previous meetings. I got to go back to this one. Okay. Here we go. See if this works for getting them in. Whoops. See if that works. If you can send that to Frankie, who that would be, let's see if that works. Otherwise, I don't have anything with regards to passcode waiting or anything like that. Anyone could join. All right, so we're going to go back to sharing. Okay, so on that one, go back to full screen. All right. Oh yeah, so this is also another one. When you do kind of things, again, it's kind of maybe this is where you might want to say okay, you can't all solve people's issues. Ignoring them or kind of diminishing their concerns is not probably an effective route. So you kind of want to kind of you don't necessarily always have to solve their problem for them immediately. You do not need to do that. But what you do need to know is that what they do need to know is that they've been heard. And that that is kind of being put into the kind of collective thought processes of the group as a whole. So in many ways, one of the kind of things that we kind of often will use on this tactic is you do have people a brainstorming session when you're in that kind of stage of all the things that could kind of trip us up or something like that. You want to kind of pull those kind of all those brainstorming sessions on that one. You're not kind of being critical on that one. You're just wanting to get that open sharing happening across the group. Not all of those brainstormings, ideas on barriers or tactics or any of that stuff will be viable to move forward. And then there's always this quality assessment of that. Maybe it's just the kind of voting across the team. So here's some kind of brainstorming ideas. Give people voting, little kind of voting things. They can go around and say, identify which of these do they think are the ones that we should really be dedicating further resources into digging into. The barriers that you're facing on that kind of stuff, there could be some kind of you need to do some ranking. Which are the ones that we really should be focusing in on? You can't focus on everything and give equal due to all of these things. You do have to prioritize and pick the issues that you're going to really dig into, but make the group do that and make it kind of use democracy for good on that one. But kind of, I think I really encourage the brainstorming as the first place because it creates an open environment for people to get things out and that they can feel that they've been listening to. And then it's documented on what all the input was across the group. You don't have to address them all. You're obviously not going to have the resources and time to be able to do that. So prioritization is probably the next exercise in terms of the brainstorming kind of work to kind of wheedle down into something that's a bit more manageable. The exploration I was going to say the exploration stage is kind of that kind of it can sometimes be like, it's really fun, but then it could also be kind of challenging in the sense that not everybody's going to have the same sort of journey that they think we should be taking. There's going to be different routes and tactics that people think are the worthwhile ones. Again, also kind of bringing in that brainstorming element to it. Get all the ideas out there. Create an environment where people feel that their ideas are valued. It doesn't mean that you have to go run with every single one of those ideas. You do not at all. But kind of having that kind of creativity at at each of the stages really helps to make people feel heard and listened to, and making them think out of the box as well. And hearing people's different perspectives helps them think out of the box as well. Now everybody thinks the commitment stage, all is like kumbaya, everybody's happy and all good and stuff like that. And it is true. It is one of the best stages. But as you can say, remember we were talking about that, usually the commitment stage, this is a circle that you're going to have to do over and over and over and over again. It's not a one kick at the can. Very rarely is it. Remember, this is often the stage you have to go through each individual intervention towards your end destination that you have in mind. So commitment is really, really important. You're kind of really bringing the group together. You have some success that you collectively can kind of celebrate. Please do take the time to celebrate it. Don't just kind of feel that you don't because you haven't finished your end goal that you don't deserve to take the time to celebrate it. You absolutely do. And we need to do that. We absolutely need to do that. So also kind of giving some rewards on that one, kind of really profile for those who have been helping to make this happen, what the change, individuals who have been benefited from this change, really bring them together, makes it so much more real in terms of people being able to use this win, use this progress to propel themselves further over time. Okay, so this is another strategy. Remember, we were talking about the W5 strategy. It's like, usually you can get you like 60 to 70% there. Then you bring in the dimensional equity kind of perspective. Again, a lot of duplication coming into it. You're kind of asking the same questions in different ways, but there is some duplication. That's okay. It just helps you kind of think that there might be different angles and different ways of looking at the issue. And then there's always like the just conservation framework that you're looking at. Again, you're going to find there's kind of some repetition associated with the other kind of analyses that you pass on to it. And if you are getting the same answers over and over again, that's a sign that you're kind of digging into where you're good and solid. But you're just making sure that you're asking questions in different ways, because those different ways of asking questions can tease out different components to it. This force feed analysis is very similar in terms of the change management process as well. So you really want to kind of say, like, describing the current situation. What is the status quo? Why is it an issue? Describe the desired situation. What do you want? Like, what is it that you want the situation to be? Identifying the driving forces. What are the forces that can really help make this change, address this gap, and help move this gap from where you are to where you think you need to be? What are the forces that are driving away from this kind of like, what's the resistance forces that are kind of creating that, kind of mapping this out and kind of drawing this map and getting people to kind of give you this input from all of their different perspectives. But this can kind of help to kind of build that kind of brainstorming kind of across the group. And then there's really kind of examining the strength of the forces. Those who are most likely, what are the kind of positive reinforcing forces? What are the resistance forces? Again, this is more of a prioritization exercise. You can't address them all. So which are the ones that are the most important, most likely to happen, and your ability to most influence? And then developing your action plan, implementing the action plan, achieving short-term wins. Don't miss this. That's a critical piece in terms of things that can really help to make success happen. Again, then once you do it, you're kind of reviewing your action plan and identifying going back to the beginning. Where is your current situation right now? Where is the status quo? That's based on your new change position. And then you're going to do this again to get to the next change position that you want. Now, again, If you can make it all the way from where you are right now to your end destination, more power to you, and go gung ho. But that in many complex in change efforts that you're going to be a part of, you won't be able to make that one big leap. It's too big a jump, and you'll need to have it take it into smaller bite-sized pieces or smaller jumps that you can land on the rock and not get thrown into the river and sent down the creek. All right, some of the kind of tactics, strategies for change elements. Involve the people who will be affected by the change. If you don't get the kind of buy-in from those folks, you're going to have a much weaker team that is going to be supporting your change taking place. Communicating a good reason, one that is relevant and for the change. And always, you're going to get busy people will always resist change because they've got so much on their plate and they just don't think it's as important as the things that are already on their plate. So how is it just as important, if not more important, than things that are on their plate already? A champion for the change. So I'm not saying if you can, again, this is where you kind of balance between you want to have a leadership position, but you don't always want to put all your eggs in one basket on that one. So you want to kind of, if you can get a champion for the change, and if you get that person who's powerful or influential, absolutely go on to it. Whether they're going to be there forever or a short time period, you want to jump on that opportunity. Just don't put all of your efforts into one person. The transitional management team, again, this is what I was saying, is that no one individual is charismatic or talented enough to run this change on their own. You want to build that champion and capacity across the team as a whole. It also makes your team much more resilient to the staff turnover that's going to inevitably happen, the organizational turnover that's going to always happen in any kind of change management endeavor. And then helping with regards to training and new values, skills, and behaviors. If you can bring that into the team, that's absolutely really helpful in helping people feel kind of, it's in some ways the team building, but they also feel like they're getting something out of it as well. And they feel and they've learned something and feel personal benefit from that. So if you can bring that into the team, that's always going to help you in your team building and change buy-in over time. Sometimes you'll need to bring in external help. Sometimes the dynamics inside the team are such that it's not constructive and something's missing. And that's where you might want to bring in, again, therapy help. You can call it a facilitator, Greek team, or you could just call it a therapist, a little bit kind of getting a little bit of a new blood in the group who has a little bit more of an authority kind of figure that they're kind of working through this. So it's not necessarily a team player trying to play that role, but someone who's been brought in to help the team as a whole do that. It's sometimes when you have a little bit too much dysfunction in a group, you really want to bring in a third party who doesn't have any baggage for anyone in the group and who can see that high level outsider's perspective. And then there's really kind of rewarding the team, rewarding individuals, rewarding the team as a whole, celebrating your success where you do get it on that is really, really important on that too. All right. So that's the kind of the helping change, overcoming resistance to change, which you're going to be which you're going to be encountering as well on that one. Was Frankie able to get in? Shahana?
I saw him inside. I don't know. Yes, he's here. He's here.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So that's a little bit of the kind of the change management exercise. As I was mentioning, I was going to throw in again the same, give a little bit of a plug for they're the kind of really great book on this topic. And let's see, cancel. I can just go allow that. And I'm going to do a little bit of a plug just in case anyone's really interested in that. And then same thing with the partnership brokering. I'm just going to throw that in there. There's some additional resources. Partnership, oops. Bring that URL for you guys as well. Ah, crapola. Sorry. All right. Any questions? Any challenges? Any huge gaps you're like, wait a second, you missed something here that I've encountered in the past and I've been stumped by? How many people kind of, in terms of it, kind of thinking of like the change feeling overwhelming? It is. Oh, it's not working, eh? What did I do wrong? Maybe it doesn't have that comma there. Oh, it doesn't have the slash. Oh, the byte. So yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Sure. So I'm gonna give you his LinkedIn profile. Do others have like different tactics that your kind of approaches that you're looking in your change management that you'd like to share? I mean, it's a whole area of study in itself, change management.
I don't know if this is at all helpful, but like and this is like not environmentally related necessarily, but I work with a lot of like I do emotional management for folks who are either in incarceration, coming out of incarceration, or doing it for core purposes, like X, Y, and Z. Basically, they're mandated to do it. So they're
Right.
not there because they want to be there. And so I think that's always been like an interesting little like kind of like a case study for me because it's again like getting folks to engage in something that they really just like they don't want to be there for. Like that's not their what they want to do with their Wednesday night. That's not what they want to do for their Saturday. And so I guess like the only thing that I can think can kind of translate well is that I always try to acknowledge that and I always try to like meet them where they're at. So like if that means saying like, yeah, like this is not what we want to do on our Wednesday night, I totally understand that. Like I am not here to like force you to do more than what we are capable of doing. Like so again, like just being I guess like to start change by indicating that you know that that it sucks like in the first place, like that we're all on the same page, that like yeah, like no one wants to do this work. Like no, it would be very nice if these things could just occur on their own, or like if you could snap your fingers and like you know your ability to manage your own emotions or like be able to get like environmental regulations in place. Like it'd be really nice if we didn't have to do that work. But I guess like to again be like and yeah, those like not incremental but like the even like the attitudinal shifts, right? So like when I talk to and again it's all men typically from the age of like 28 to 40 something in these groups. So like they're pretty set in their ways normally and they don't want to be there. So I normally say like, yeah, like we all don't want to be here. All that I ask is that you like keep your mind open to the idea that something in this hour, in this half hour, whatever it might be, like will end up resonating with you. Doesn't mean that it will, doesn't mean that like, you know, you're going to change your life by the end of tonight. But I guess just like yeah, that attitudinal shift in itself being like, no, I'm not here to be against you. Like we're not like I'm not here to fight you. I really don't want to. Like that's not what I want to do with my night either. And finding a way to like indicate that like even those like small things can make a big difference in what the outcome will be.
And you could help them reframe it too. Like you can kind of like, absolutely, if you or you just in order to fulfill your outcome that you need to achieve, you just need to show up and
Mhm.
be here in this room. You don't have to absorb anything. You don't have to
Yeah.
agree with anything that is being said. And that's one way you can go through and achieve your outcome that you're trying to achieve as part of being part of this exercise. That's one way. It'll solve it. Or you could also still do all that, but you might actually try and see whether you can get one thing that you think is of value from
Yeah.
each of these hours. And if that's the case, then you are better. You know, it's not like you're going to be like rewarding those who threw you into this process, and you're like, you're really going to punish them by not learning anything here. You know? But it's helping people reframe it to kind of see, are they really serving themselves the way they could be
Yeah.
serving themselves?
Yeah. Yeah, again, and I think that like being able the like phrase like meeting people where they're at is really something that I try to hold on to. And I think like especially with like climate deniers and stuff like that,
Yeah.
like rather than fully like I don't know, like going head to head with folks like that, you try to look at the little things
Yeah.
because also being in like having done philosophy for years, you're used to people who want to play devil's advocate. And
Mhm.
often like I think that's the part that I have a hard time with is like sometimes you can engage with those folks thinking that they're trying to legitimately have a conversation, but what
But they're
they're
snakes.
trying to do is just play around. Like they're having fun. They're having fun arguing
Yeah.
with you, and that's like a
They're
great
just emotionally manipulating you.
yeah. Oh, and they love it.
Yeah, they do love
It's
it.
yeah. So it's like, also like understanding where that your own energy is valuable and that
Yeah.
like it's not worth your energy to spend on
And you
people.
don't have to convince everyone.
No.
That's not your job. Yeah. Sophia.
Yeah, I don't, this doesn't exactly relate to climate change, but I try really hard not to argue with people who have a different opinion than myself. Sometimes I do argue with people about different opinions, but I try not to because
Mhm.
I just don't, I want people to have what they say, but I write stories on my downtime, and a lot of people like say, "Oh, update, update." And I used to view it in such a negative lens, like, I'm busy, what do you expect me to do? And then I kind of like took out the context and said, you know what? They're excited. They like what I'm doing. And then I just manage my time. If I have an assignment deadline, I don't update. If I
Yeah.
just don't want, like, it's about balance for me. Like, if
Yeah.
I need to balance my life, I need to balance it much more. And there's some times where I don't want to be on doing anything. I just want to relax. And
Yeah.
it's totally logical, and it should be acceptable that, you know what, we can say no and have it be totally normalized. I think no, especially when it's women who
Yeah.
say no to men or anyone else, we're assumed as being bossy or not at all. By the way, happy International Women's Day, everybody.
Yeah. Happy International Women's Day. But I got you. That's where you kind of like want to kind of like, you have to know what you're willing and able to deal with. And that has to be your boundaries that you create. So it doesn't mean like, if the only one thing I would challenge on that one, don't like thinking about it, like you absolutely have to kind of think about what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. But you're going to be dealing where in conflictual circumstances throughout your life and career. And knowing which battles to take on and which battles not to take on is just as important as boundaries, because you're going to inevitably have to take on battles. You got to pick which ones are the ones you think are good ones to deal with. And I'd say that those two, boundaries and also trying to say, okay, where am I going to get out of my comfort zone on this one, is just as important too. Picking those efforts to get out of your comfort zone is going to be important, but not to taking on so much that you just shut down because it's too much. Yeah, comfortable with the uncomfortable. It's not fun, not fun at all. And absolutely, Shahana, I was thinking about it because like trying to making yourself ready to afraid to fail. That is so critical because failure is inevitable. like that, it is inevitable. If you're going to be doing change management, you are not going to get away from failure. You are not going to win all your change efforts. There's not a chance that you're going to win them all. So failure is inevitable, but failure for after trying, and this is where it's important to kind of like figure out which are the battles you're going to take on. That's, you know, hard lesson number one, to figure out which battles you're going to take on and which ones you're going to have to say no to. But you're also going to be thinking about it from the perspective that if you don't make that change, you're guaranteed to fail. Absolutely 100% chance of failure. Whereas you might only have a 75% chance of failure if you do attempt something. And you might have a 50% chance of failure if you're just going to be endeavoring something else that you that's where the short term wins. It's a 50-50 chance, flip of the coin. Will you succeed? Will you fail? But at least under there, even if you have failed, you have put the effort into it. You've learned something, because each change exercise that you are a part of, I can probably tell you, you're going to learn something from that experience of being part of that change process. Go towards the change you want to see happen, not where the change presently is. Is that what we're also going to go into and get all these sports analogies on it?
I think you said you miss all the shots you don't take.
Exactly, yeah. All right, perfect. So thanks everyone. I should just one last thing just before just one last thing. I did want to kind of get some last changes I did want to kind of get to on this one, because I didn't get to it. Oh, right. So we'll do this next week, but I did want to kind of get some presentation best practices. Keep your slides consistent. It's very visually discomforting for people when designs change from slide to slide. So keeping some consistency is really good. It helps to mean people are focusing on what you're saying and what's on the slides, and not just being jarred by the different visuals associated with different slides. Use as many visuals as you can. Use images. It's just so much more powerful than just a whole bunch of text on a PowerPoint slide. Title it. What's the main point of this one slide? What's the main thing you want them to understand from this slide? The title is that main point. Tell a continuous story. Don't jump from kind of one place to each other. Kind of a table of contents that has been provided does kind of bring you through a storytelling kind of narrative, but tell a continuous story. Don't jump from the kind of like what the problem is to really what the solution is, in the sense of without kind of digging into the different pieces. Give them the kind of clear, give them enough information that when you do present what the possible interventions are, they understand why you selected those interventions. Again, my same things, don't be text heavy in your slides. That's what your report is for. You don't need to be text heavy on your slides. Have your notes, keep your notes on your own. You don't need to share them. Too much text means people are just reading and they're not listening to what you're saying. I know I don't follow that. That's okay. I know that. But I also mean, I didn't want a textbook, because the slides for this course is the textbook. Try not to read. Really use your bullet point notes for making sure you're getting to your points, but your engagement with the audience is very different when you're just looking down and reading from notes. It is very different. People can tell you're not engaging and you're not talking to them. You're just reading from your notes, and their engagement with you will be affected by you just reading notes on that one. So I really highlight, don't read notes. Don't just have bullets, and speak to your bullets. You know your topic, speak to your bullets. And then number your slides, just to kind of people kind of usually when it kind of goes back to questions. You know the slide that you were doing with this image on it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, then you can get back to your slides a little bit helpful on that one. And really when it comes to tell your story and try not to read from your notes, they go together. You know your topic, have confidence in your understanding of the topic, tell the story, but don't read your story. And those are kind of my kind of presentation best practices. Right. So I hope you have a wonderful week off next week. Is it block placement or is it intercession? It's block placement. Okay, so it's not a week off. hope you have a great block placement, and hope it's a good experience. And I will see you in 2 weeks' time. And if people have questions on the case study, just send me an email. If you can send it to G Collipush at that one. So I'm just going to set this one because I do check that a lot more. And if you do have questions, did I get that right? If you do have questions, I will put them in an email to everybody to share the questions that come in and the answers that have been provided so that everybody can have that information. And I will be sending out just after this all of your marks thus far that I have on record. And if there's something I'm missing, let me know. All right. Have a great 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.